This video is for anyone thinking about buying or selling a restored comic book and thinking, how the heck do I price a purple label book? In a previous video, I revealed that my restored copy of Captain America Comics #1 is worth only about 15% of its unrestored cousin. You might wonder, are all restored copies worth only 15% of their unrestored version? The answer is no, it's way more complicated. In this video, I'll be sharing 7 lessons I've learned on how to price a restored comic book. And as a bonus, I'll share a pricing cheat sheet that a buddy shared with me. But first, let's dive into the history of comic book restoration because views have changed dramatically over the decades. Restoration used to be considered a good thing. In the early days of collecting, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the goal of many dealers and collectors was to make an old book look as good as possible. In fact, you could increase the value of a book dramatically by restoring it. For example, you could take an Action Comics #1 at a 2.0 or a good level, restore it to a 6.0 and get 6.0 money for it. That's why restoration is relatively common for books that were published between the 1930s and the 1960s. In fact, for the 2 most expensive books in the hobby, Action Comics #1, First Superman, and Detective Comics #27, First Batman, there are nearly as many restored copies as there are unrestored copies. Somewhere in the 80s and 90s, the opinion of restored books began to shift. People were wondering if restoration would harm the hobby. The logic went something like this. If restored books are incentivized, then more and more books are going to be restored. And many folks in the hobby didn't like this. They thought that books should be in their purest form, unrestored, and therefore the unrestored books should carry a price premium. Fast forward to 2000, and that's when the proverbial nail was hammered into the coffin of restored books. That's the year when CGC began grading and slabbing comic books. And for restored comic books, they gave it a particular label, the purple label, sometimes called the purple label of death. Now it's clear as day to any buyer if a book had been doctored. That brings us to the present day and how to price a restored comic book. Let's dive into lesson number 1. The prevailing school of thought is that a book shouldn't be worth more if it's restored. And that makes sense given what we've talked about before, that we don't want to incentivize restoration because if we do, fewer and fewer unrestored books will exist. That means if a book starts off as a 2.0 unrestored copy and gets restored up to a 6.0, that 6.0 restored book should cost less than that 2.0. One problem is that it's very difficult to determine what the original starting value or starting grade of that book might be once it's been restored. However, the level of restoration is a good clue. If you see a book with moderate to extensive restoration, it likely started off as being a really low grade. How do I know that? Because if you have major defects, it often takes a lot of work to counteract that defect to make that book look good again. For example, if a third of the front page is missing, it's going to take some extensive restoration to make that front page look whole again. Which brings me to the next lesson. All restoration is not the same. CGC now provides information about the quality and quantity of restoration. Let's check out how CGC lays it out. So first is quality, or the aesthetic scale, and there's an A, B, and C. So excellent, an A is really good quality materials, rice paper, wheat paste, acrylic or watercolor, and leaf casting. The color match is near perfect with no bleed through. Now, if we go down a step to fine, we're talking about material used are things like pencil, crayon, and chalk, reglossing agent, piece fill for cadavers, and the piece fill is obvious upon close inspection and obvious to the touch. Now, if you go all the way down to C, which is very amateurish or poor, the material used is glue, pen, marker, whiteout, white paper to fill missing pieces, and the piece fill is obvious at arm's length. I remember seeing a video of Matt Nelson talking about seeing a restored book, and he could just see it from across the room just because the restoration was so obvious. Obviously, that would be a C quality level of restoration. Now let's take a look at the quantity scale. This is primarily determined by the extent of piece fill and color touch. Let's take a look at 1, or slight. All conservation work, reglossing, interior lightening, piece fill no more than size of 2 boundary chips, light color touch in small areas like spine stress, corner crease or boundary chip fill, mirror cover or interior pages wraps, if other work is present. In other words, this is very, very minor restoration. Now let's move up to the next step, which is slight to moderate. So this is piece fill up to 1/2 by 1/2 inches and or color touch covering up to 1 by 1 inches. Interior piece fill up to 1 inch by 1 inch. So we're starting to see more work done. Let's go up to moderate. Piece fill up to the size of 1 by 1 inch and or color touch covering up to 2 inches by 2 inches. Interior piece fill up to 2 by 2 inches. Going on to the next level is moderate extensive, which is a 4. Piece fill up to size of 2 by 2 inches and or color touch covering up to 4 by 4 inches. Interior piece fill up to 2 by 4 inches. And finally, extensive is any piece fill over 2 by 2 inches and or color touch over 4 by 4 inches. This could also include recreated interior pages or cover. When you start getting into extensive, these are just massive, massive things done to help a comic book look better. CGC provides more details, but that should give you a sense of how they categorize restoration. Consequently, A1 books should be discounted the least compared to Blue Label books, and C5 the most. From what you've learned in the first two lessons, lesson 3 follows. Don't use a simple rule to discount the Purple Label books. How much to discount varies widely depending on the quantity and quality of restoration. And by the way, this pointer is different from what you might hear. One of my favorite comic book YouTubers made a blanket statement in a video that approximately a Purple Label book should receive a 35% discount from a Blue Label. In other words, Purple Label books should be worth about 65% of Blue Label books. I have to disagree. I think having a blanket statement about what kind of discount you should get for a Purple Label book is only going to get you in trouble. You have to look into specifics. And that brings me to lesson number 4. High grade Purple Label books equal big discount. For unrestored Blue Label books, that the prices start going up exponentially beyond a 6.5. That's due to conditional rarity for silver and golden age books. However, if a book has been restored from a 1.0 to a 9.0, it doesn't make sense to give the restored book that exponential price bump. That's why you'll see such a huge price discrepancy between a high-grade Blue Label book and a high-grade Purple Label book. Let me give you an even more extreme example. A couple months ago, a copy of Amazing Fantasy 15 sold for $3.6 million. It was a Blue Label book at a 9.6 grade, and there's only 4 copies total that are at that 9.6 level for AF15 and none higher. So a truly world-class book. Now imagine somebody took a 1.0 copy of Amazing Fantasy 15 and applied crazy extensive restoration and got it all the way up to a 9.6. How much would that 9.6 extensively restored copy cost? My guess is it would go for somewhere between $25,000 and maybe $35,000. In other words, it would sell for more than a 99% discount to the 9.6 unrestored copy, as it should. My point here is that Purple Label books are going to sell for a whole heck of a lot less than Blue Label books in those nosebleed grades. Lesson number 5, A1 is a special case. Recall that A is the best quality of restoration and 1 is the least amount of quantity. In fact, the number that you see or the grade that you see on the Purple Label book is probably only slightly higher than what you would have seen if that book was unrestored, never restored in the first place, and Blue Label. For that reason, people are willing to pay a higher percent of the Blue Label cost for a particular grade for an A1 copy. Furthermore, because the work is done so well and over such a little space of the book, oftentimes this restoration can be removed. So somebody might buy an A1 copy, they'll send it to a professional who will try to remove the restoration. That book comes back to the collector, they'll send it back out to CGC, and it may come back a Blue Label book. Lesson number 6. For most books that have moderate to extensive restoration, that they'll be priced as if they were a Blue Label book in that 0.5 to 2.0 range. This makes sense to me because if a book has that level of restoration, it more than likely started off as a very low grade unrestored copy. This situation comes into play for me and many other collectors when we're going after a grail, one that's almost out of our reach. For example, when I was going after Cap 1, I was looking at Poors, 0.5s, and Fairs 1.0, or I could be looking at these high-grade Purple Label books, and ultimately I ended up getting that 8.0 moderately restored Cap 1, and I was really happy about it. So one thing I wanted to share is that I'm not trying to diss Purple Label books. Oftentimes, they're a great pathway to getting that upper tier book that you couldn't get otherwise. Lesson number 7, expect unpredictable prices for Purple Label books. I'm often watching auctions and I see a Purple Label book sell, and I scratch my head thinking, gosh, that's way cheaper than I thought it would sell for. And then another auction might happen, and I scratch my head again and think, wow, that was way more expensive. I would have never paid that much money for that book. So sometimes prices are all over the place. I think one of those reasons is because it's so hard to find comps for a purple label book. For example, imagine you're seeing a Amazing Fantasy 15 at a 6.0 purple label, and the restoration level is a B3. You might look at Go Collect or GP Analysis and find out, gosh, a B3 hasn't sold for 4 years, and that was the last price. That was way back in the day. Or maybe there's another copy, a 6.0 purple label, but the restoration type is way off. Maybe it's an A5 as opposed to your B3. So it's really hard to find those comps. That's why I'm so thankful to my buddy, Comic Collector Geek. He found a cool cheat sheet for how to value purple label books. Classics Incorporated, which you can find on this website. It's valuing restored comics. And I'm going to read out loud the instructions. It says below are general formula that can be used to determine the value of restored comics. Multiply the number given with the unrestored value in the Overstreet price guide to determine an estimated value. You can basically substitute that value in Overstreet by whatever way you use to get an estimate of the blue label value. Maybe that's Go Collect, maybe that's GPA analysis. There are various ways to determine what you think the blue label should sell for. It says these numbers are based on professionally restored comics. Books with amateur work would be worth 15 to 20% less. These formulas serve only as a benchmark. Each book is unique and may vary in pricing. So good caveat there to begin with. So now let's go down to the actual table, and it's separated between Golden Age books and Silver Age books for restoration. On both cases, if you look on the left-hand side, you can see the grade of the book, and APP stands for apparent or restored. And so they're saying that if you're looking at a apparent near mint 9.4 Golden Age book, that if it was slight restoration, then you should pay 25% of what the blue label book would sell for at a 9.4. Moderate restoration would be 20%, and extensive restoration would be 0.125. As we move down in the grade to the lower grades, then the discount is less severe than it is at the top of the scale. And that's something that we talked about before. Now, if we go down to Silver Age restoration, that in general, the discount is even greater than it is for Golden Age. Now, as a caveat, I don't agree with all these discounts. In fact, I probably would provide deeper discounts than what's provided there. But what I do like about this sheet is that it has that logic that I like. It shows different books at different restoration levels and how much they should be discounted. I hope this video helped you out with pricing purple label books. If you missed my introduction to the purple label, check out this video. If you're interested in pricing blue label books, check out this video. Thanks so much for hanging with me, and hope to see you around real soon.